Thank you very much for inviting me. What I want to do is talk a little bit about the U.S.-China cyber relationship, talk a little bit about why I think it's going to get worse, and then I always try to end on a happy note, why it might get better, but you're going to see my heart's not really in the get better part. So it's been an incredibly busy year in the U.S.-China cyber relationship. I'm not going to go through these things, but probably the three most important things that have happened was the founding of the small leadership group for cybersecurity, for information security under Xi Jinping, the indictment of 5 PLA hackers this year from the Department of Justice, and then just last month, the World Internet Conference that China held, and increasing kind of interaction back and forth between the two sides. The problem when you think about the U.S.-China cyber relationship is not only, as Herb said, about what categories we're talking about, is that both of those terms, U.S.-China relationships and cyber, are constantly in flux. So what we're seeing in the U.S.-China relationship right now is a dramatic change from what used to be a U.S. policy of hedge and engagement towards China to what could be a slide towards coercive diplomacy and deterrence. Right? Much of this has been pushed over conflict in the maritime regions of East China Sea and the South China Sea, but there's clearly been a hardening of thinking on both sides of the Pacific in strategic realms about how the two sides should deal with each other. The other term, cyber, is also in flux. What are we most worried about with China? Are we worried about an attack that turns off the power grid, like NSA and Cyber Command head Admiral Rogers warned about 2 weeks ago? Or are we worried about what General Alexander, the former head of NSA, used to call the greatest transfer of wealth in human history, like the stealing of IP? We're worried about both. And how worried should we be about those two threats? Given those two concepts are constantly in flux and are sliding, I would characterize the relationship right now of extreme interdependence, economic interdependence that is still mutually beneficial, but commercial and strategic rivalry with a high degree of irritation. Right? So it's not a very catchy bumper sticker, but the big themes are interdependence and irritation. Right? And so the question as we move forward is, how can we assure that the irritation doesn't grow so much that we stop valuing the interdependence? And I'm fairly pessimistic about how high the irritation is going to get. The first reason is that both sides are seeing themselves as increasingly vulnerable. And you saw this in the testimony that I just mentioned with Admiral Rogers, basically saying it's not a question of when, it's not a question of if, it's a question of when there's going to be a destructive cyber attack on the United States. And Chinese defense analysts, to the extent that they speak about this publicly, being very, very pessimistic about ever catching up to the United States, and also being very, very sensitive to the vulnerability on the Chinese side. So just this week, China announced that it was starting a new laboratory to explore vulnerabilities in industrial control systems because they are worried about attacks on power grids and other places. And in the reports that announced it, the headline was, China's industrial control system information situation is grim. So they're worried as they move forward. Once you have a situation where you think defense is never possible and deterrence isn't possible, then you think about offense. Right? How do you stop an attack before it happens, or how do you respond very quickly? And that is very bad for strategic instability. Right? Both sides begin to think about having to move very quickly early in a conflict. The other reason the trend is going to worsen is that both sides are addicted to data. Right? Nobody's going to stop spying at any time. Right? The United States has essentially justified that for surveillance reasons, for counterterrorism. Right? And here's this quote from a Director of National Intelligence Clapper, which is, when you're looking for the needle in a haystack, you have to collect all the data out there. You have to collect the haystack. And so he said, if you have a better way of finding the needles than collecting the haystacks, let me know. But we've seen, after this known revelations, there's been very, very limited reforms of the type of data that NSA is going to collect. And the Chinese, from their part, also look like they're addicted to data. most of that being IP from US, Japanese, and European companies. But right now, there is no cost to them to collect that data. And the Chinese have not bought the US argument that there are two types of spying. Right? There's the spying that the United States does, which is generally focused on military and intelligence aspects. And then the type of spying that we criticize China for, which is stealing IP to give to commercial competitors. The problem is that many of the countries in the rest of the world don't believe that the United States actually makes that distinction. And some of the Snowden revelations have suggested that there have been economic targets of espionage. So Petrobras, Huawei, Chinese telecom units. And while the US will say, no, no, we spied on those organizations for national security reasons, that's not an argument that gains a lot of traction in the rest of the world. And so the Chinese really don't see the distinction between spying, those two types of spying. The third reason why I think the trends are going to get worse is there's an increasing tendency on both sides to kind of blur the line between private and public actors. And we see this clearly in much of the reaction to the PLA indictment, but even before that, the Chinese government has always been deeply suspicious about US technology companies and their relationship to the NSA. China has been saying that there are backdoors in US products since the early 2000s, if not before that. So there's always been a worry about the security vulnerabilities. And there's always been this desire to reduce dependence on the West. And the cybersecurity concerns now feed into that, right? Indigenous innovation becomes even more critical when you're worried about Western companies. And the Chinese, are very happy to note that many of the former employees of CrowdStrike and Mandiant and FireEye, the companies that are releasing the reports on Chinese cybersecurity attacks on the New York Times and other places, used to work for the NSA and other government agencies. So they will basically say, look, you guys are coordinating between your companies and the government as well. And on the US side, there is, as we've seen, deep suspicion about the action of Chinese firms. Huawei is the most prominent concern, but any tech acquisition in the United States that is going to involve the telecom infrastructure or important parts of IT are going to be considered by CFIUS, the Committee on Foreign Investment of the United States. Finally, neither side is really having a particularly easy role in domestic politics. I mean, on the Chinese side, it's the creation of this small leadership group under Xi Jinping is a sign that the Chinese were really having a difficult time coordinating across the PLA, the Ministry of State Security, the MPS, the Ministry of Public Security, the State Encryption Bureau, and the IT community. So there was really a need to try to consolidate many overlapping agenda. And on the US side, we have congressional gridlock. Right? The president has been tried to push some regulations, and Congress tried to push regulation on information sharing and government standards. Those all failed. The president had to issue an executive order on voluntary standard, and we were looking to see if this year we might get some movement, but it's very unlikely on the domestic legislation side. And what that means is that you get a lot of hype, especially from people testifying to Congress, trying to get the legislation through. So you'll hear lots of digital 9/11s and digital Pearl Harbors, and as Herb said, people comparing cyber strikes to nuclear strikes. So finally, why would this get better? And this is primarily focused on the Chinese perspective. Why would China change its attitude? The first one is what Herb was also alluding to, is that the Chinese economy is going to become as dependent on IT as the US economy. And the Chinese military is going to become as dependent on IT as the US military is. Right? The Chinese military wants to be a net-centering force. And once you start having some mutual vulnerabilities, then you can begin to think about deterrence and some type of agreements on we shouldn't strike the financial sector, we shouldn't strike computer emergency response teams. Are there some kind of ways we can control escalation? The second, and this is not a completely baked thought, which is that we're beginning to see some separation between the companies and governments pushed by the companies themselves. right? And this we clearly see on the US side in the wake of the Snowden revelations. Companies like Microsoft and Apple and Google are taking a technical and a legal stand against the US in the range of surveillance, right? So Apple saying we're going to encrypt phones and we can't give you the key. Microsoft fighting a US government request for data that's stored in Ireland. These are all efforts to say we are global companies, we have consumers everywhere, we're going to do what we can to protect them and their privacy. Chinese firms are not at that point yet, although the language of the Chinese firms as they globalize is changing, right? Xiaomi had an instance where data was being sent back to China. They had to then say, no, we're going to keep the data local. The language of Huawei has changed dramatically over the last 10 years about transparency and inspection and third-party roles. So you can imagine that over time, the companies would start having a huge amount of shared interest in global transparent norms. And then finally, China, at least over the last 30 years, and we'll have to see if Xi Jinping's foreign policy takes it in a different direction, has not been a revisionist power. It has not liked to be outside the status quo, and it has generally moved closer to accepted international norms. The best example of this has been proliferation, right? If we think about China in the 80s and the 90s, they were fairly willing to sell a whole range of missile and nuclear technologies to the North Koreans and Iranians and Pakistanis and others. That changed for a number of reasons. One, the Chinese realized that having a nuclear Pakistan on its border wasn't really in its best interest, but it also began to accept those norms, and it hasn't been perfect, right? We still see China selling things to Iran that we're not happy about, but it has moved much closer to the globally accepted norms than it ever would. So you could imagine that if the United States and Brazil and other emerging internet powers managed to agree on some norms of internet behavior, what you can attack and what you couldn't, that the Chinese would slowly move over time to meet those norms. That's all the positive view, but the sour tone I always have to end on is that these are all long-term goals. They're not going to happen anytime soon. We're at the very early stage of developing all these norms, and so my original prediction of irritation is unfortunately the likely one.